That's how you do it? Games just aren't like they used to be. At least, that's the prevailing sentiment I end up seeing a lot in online circles. Games nowadays don't have the care or passion put into them, and they're just not fun. Twitter profile pictures will claim AAA games are husks of their former selves. But I'll be honest, I just haven't noticed that becoming mainstream whatsoever. Now don't get me wrong, there are definitely soulless, cash-driven games out there that only want to give your wallet the old Glub Glub 3000, especially if you're looking at any series that's gone on with yearly releases for up to a decade now. But the total and complete disregard for a lot of AAA or AA games in the modern day for classics of the PS3 and Xbox 360 era feels like the largest pair of rose-tinted glasses that's ever existed over an entire industry. Alongside a lot of that classical polarization we get with social media, farming for biggest emotions rather than the truth. And this is going to be a little bit of young man yells at old man who yells at clouds, but I see these opinions that come from a place of nostalgia and bitterness in people's old age get watered down and become the opinion of people who may not have even grown up with an Xbox 360, or who hold that games in 2018 were better than games are now, which is just untrue. Now sure, they're standouts, but to be honest, I feel like a lot of games, even old classics, barely hold up to their modern counterparts. Not to mention that today, you can play all of the new games that are coming out that are also great, as well as the old ones. The old ones haven't gone anywhere. Really quick, I want to give a gigantic thank you to all my beautiful members and patrons who you can join for just $1 a month. If you want to know more, stick around until the end. For now, let's get back into it. There's a core question at the center of this discussion. What does better even mean? It's an inherently subjective question because what you want out of a game is entirely separate from what someone else may want. Do you want customization options? Do you want fluid controls? Do you want a good story? Do you want an active multiplayer audience? These are all valid in determining better, but don't really help us narrow down the differences between games in the past and modern games. But there's a lot of layers there. So welcome all you beautiful ladies and animals, let's break it down across the years and look at just how some old classics hold up, what their modern sequels and counterparts look like in the present day, and what the wholesale of years have looked like from past compared to more recent years, showing us if it's really a case that games have gotten worse in general, or have they only gotten better in the last 2 decades? Or is it a matter of the market itself shifting radically and not the games? Now, there's a general timeline of creation and innovation that follows nearly every field of art or science, from beginning to end, with all the variant branching paths in the middle. I call these the cycles of innovation. Nothing we've ever made have been perfect from the get-go. Hell, engineers even find ways to innovate upon the wheel every once in a while. But everything from film to cars to light bulbs to Warhammer 40k follows a path of invention. It starts with the innovation of a new field. Someone experiments with a few things. Bing bang boom, now you have Pong on a computer screen. Now everyone else wants to experiment with the same thing. This is how you get to the most importantly, to any industry is the bare proving grounds of its existence, the Cambrian explosion, where once there was nothing, there's now everything. This isn't an era of gaming that's worth comparing with modern games. Pong, old arcade cabinets, classics, Doom, no, Wolfenstein 3D. These early titles who don't have anything to prove, no polish, no user experience, or tightly designed monetization structures. This is a historical cycle which is valid and revered simply for laying the framework of what a video game even is. And as that idea begins to grow, we enter into the often an era of art that makes us most aware of the classics. This is where creations thrive on the precipice, just before the standardized expectations for the medium take hold. Where visionaries and artists really hit their stride, still not overly focused on straight polish, but more testing the boundaries of what's possible. Like Citizen Kane laying the foundations of what we think of when it comes to film. This is where games like Narbacular Drop come in. Of course, is Portal better in every way? Yes, but that's not the purpose of what this cycle represents. This is where the Hideo Kojimas come in and start playing with ideas and using every last tool available to them, like save slots or other wacky ideas, because there's no set expectations. The good part of this form from a business standpoint is also that before we have strong guidelines of what a game in X genre should be, there's companies that are willing to take risks based on what might be possible, even if similar ideas have failed in the past. This is where a lot of ideas and the untouchable classics are born, but I wouldn't consider this to be part of those better games that outshine modern examples, at least as people claim. Which brings us to the Here, around the time of the PS2 and Xbox 360, we have solid foundations. This is where gaming really hits its strides, and people's expectations are formed for real. All day long, you can say that Kill Switch came out before Gears of War, and was the first to really set the grounds for third-person cover shooters, to pioneer the genre. But Gears is where the genre first hit widespread market appeal, where the general idea of what a cover shooter is, what it should be, came to form. This is where we see games that don't experiment as much, but not for lack of quality, as they distill the qualities they do have further and further into a more perfect format. There were other cover shooters like Army of Two and Mass Effect, but as Gears of War grew in popularity, those other series changed the way they approached cover shooting to better reflect what people had come to expect as a good cover shooter. Call of Duty getting better gunplay and more reactive controls. Gears, as I mentioned, became more fluid and expanded its game systems out by Gears 3. Going from The Sims to The Sims 3 made massive changes almost always for the better. Some games didn't even need to lay the grounds as it had been done for them. We already had major innovators like Half-Life around for a while, so when a new title like Dishonored comes in and even does bring new ideas, it's working off the same homogeneous genres that people were becoming familiar with. Where games benefit from being a part of a larger ecosystem because it means you're familiar with a dozen Call of Duties, Battlefields, and Medal of Honors with the same style of gameplay, you could make a small change and keep the same framework and make a giant impact that's both accessible to newcomers and still pushes the envelope, as we see in a game like Titanfall. This is where people attribute the most of their favorite classics that still hold up today, and for the most part, they do. Setting the standard means that you, by definition, meet the standard. These are games that pass a bare minimum bar as to what's expected, as newer games are judged against them. Every Gears of War game is based on how it plays and how much content it has relative to Gears 3. Whether or not Gears 3 is technically better, performs better, any of those extenuating factors don't matter as much because the standard was born here, or at least solidified here. And likely, what people can pin as the failure of the industry, we go to the Now, a lot of people, myself included, will recognize this cycle of the industry as the most harmful. With guidelines set and franchises in motion, the art and variety of what we get becomes more predictable and less interesting. Now, there's a few different ways to look at this cycle: the artsy lens, the cynical lens, and the corporate lens. Artistically, this is where a lot of games felt free to go off and experiment in ways that are more esoteric to the forms. not experimenting so much in mechanics but in storytelling or an artistic direction. Last of Us wasn't the first game to feature puzzles where you push a box into place and climb it, but it is a great example of a game focusing more so on telling a story than being a video game where the gameplay itself has to draw you in. It's more focused on the narrative. A lot of stories before this era were simple. Big green guy, shoot aliens, win day. Big Greek guy, stab demons, win day. Big pink guy, suck off baddies, win day. Even when these older games got more introspective or had a stronger message to say, it was still a backdrop to the gameplay that they had to innovate on. Now, we've seen the scale shift almost in the opposite direction, where the story of a game blended with the standardized expectations of how that game will play. Even if a game like The Last of Us has a unique approach to cover shooting, it still follows the same core principles that games like Gears had set in stone years earlier. The cynical way to see this is that games, especially the AAA franchises, begin to homogenize to levels that make each iteration boring rather than adding something new. We start to see games that feel less expansive than games in the past. Ubisoft open worlds that might literally be larger, but were more empty and lacked character. Call of Duty titles that featured all the same things fans had come to expect, but with all the charm and writing chops of earlier games entirely removed. Sports games that literally just reuse entire asset maps from the previous game, and the slow introduction of both straight-up gambling and putting a battle royale in every single game, and even when it crashes and burns in hilarious fashion, they try to do it again. Just because. But these issues continue to stem from almost exclusively the AAA market, because at the same time we see games in the indie space, famous examples like Undertale or FNAF, really take off with a heart of their own as we enter into an age so digitized and connected that a singular person could create an entire universe from their own home and share it with millions of people around the world, introducing a level of democratization to individual publishers and even smaller studios who have the option to step away from their corporate overlords and work on projects that chase passion rather than monetization. Which of course finally brings us to the corporate side of things. As we've seen, it's wrapped around the rest of the industry in obvious ways, but is mainly focused on consistent outcomes. Because when a C-suite room of board members double their net worth year over year on Call of Duty, they demand the same thing again and again until the fucking end of time. This is unsustainable and eventually nonsensical, but as long as the option seems to work and hasn't failed yet, it gets pushed all the same. Publishers don't want to take a risk on something new, something fresh. They want the same franchises that have done well for a decade to keep chugging on, or IPs that did well in the past, kept alive on life support of their name alone rather than being innovated on in a way that they need to stay relevant, in the good kind of way, not the bad kind of way. This is where the industry began to feel like it was spinning its wheels and going nowhere. Games were good, very good, but few dared to break the mold. Open world bloat became standard. Monetization crept over into nearly every AAA release. Innovation was rare, often buried under live service models, battle passes, and seasonal updates. Creativity would take a backseat to retention. You could blame a lot on this, from Fortnite to the growing influence of shareholder prospects in prioritizing profits over passionate developers. But I still don't know if this darker blemish on gaming's history is enough to write off all the good. On the upside, those few exceptions have begun to thrive in our current cycle. Here we come to a place where new, flourishing tech has led to a kind of renaissance in the medium. New tools, new ability, more power in less hands. Now, you may have noticed that I've been reluctant at this point when it comes to ascribing specific time frames to any cycle directly. Because for a majority of these, it's somewhat in flux. The reimagination cycle of taking new tech and taking these established norms to flip them on their head or rebuild them in a way that feels fresh and breathtaking has some early starters. Some studios, like Santa Monica's God of War series, did this just years in advance before the rest of the industry had pivoted to turn around. Most games come into the cycle later, mainly post-2022, once the world and video gaming in general had recovered from the big cough. But there are standouts who definitely started down this path ahead of time. But we see as tools become widely available to smaller teams, that creatives can flourish. Technically indie, but rather than a single dev grinding out something on their own, we've got smaller studios that have a lot of passion but aren't constrained by needing some massive AAA publisher in order to stay relevant. And these micro studios have dominated the space recently. Larian with Baldur's Gate, Ninja Theory with Senua's Saga, Landfall with Expedition 33. All games that are absolute 10s out of 10 titles that no big name publisher would take a chance on. Yes, they were all published, but they were not created by said publisher. Even a studio like Ninja Theory that got adopted into the Xbox ecosystem was only brought in after Senua was a giant success. But again, the new tech is a double-edged sword. Accessibility in development and the ability to update games. Now yes, some devs have taken this as an excuse to drop a half-finished game and promise to fix it years later, like with Anthem. But in other cases, it became a lot of games' best ally. Think about games that have fallen prey to bad practice in the past. A lot of people claim that older games were better because the technology mandated that they were done with the game before it shipped. And that's just not true. Bad games shipped and were bad forever. One of the main points I made when going over Gears of War Judgment in my years later video was how half-baked it felt after a rushed development between two studios into the run-up of selling the franchise. Can you imagine how much better Judgment might have been in the eyes of the player base that hated that game if they had an additional year or so to work on the game, even post-launch? Think about the games of this era that were awful on launch, whether because they were underbaked, like No Man's Sky, or were poorly made, like Cyberpunk. But both of these games are loved, respected, and revered because now we live in an era where Cyberpunk can be redeemed. Which, yeah, it shouldn't have to be redeemed to begin with, but unlike a lot of games from the early 2000s, at least it has the option and a studio behind it willing to pour in hours to make it better. Now, I'm gonna assume you know what this image of a plane is referring to. And to be totally honest, whenever I see people talk about how older games were better, this is all I think about. It's an ironic effect of our memory and nostalgia tricking us against ourselves. I don't hold anyone to some arbitrary standard if they believe it, I just think they're probably wrong. Truthfully, there's no such thing as games now or then being better. There are just good games and bad games. The date doesn't change much besides quality of the game on a technical level. Gears of War was great in 2006. That is one hell of a slog in modern day. Portal doesn't look nearly as good as games coming out now, but that doesn't hurt its credibility as an art piece. There's a lot of bad games out now too. The CODs, Veilguards, 2Ks, and other soulish cash grabs in the AAA space. But let's not forget that again, for every Gears of War, there was a Hunted, the Demon's Forge. Do you even know what the fuck that game is? That was a Bethesda title. Games have always been good and bad, but now with the proliferation of AA or indie games taking up the same amount of purchase as AAA in the public's eye, it makes the AAA pool look worse en masse when it's got the same success rate it's always had. But now, instead of having 6 good games and 4 awful stinkers in 1 year, we've got 24 good games and 16 stinkers. The ratio is the same, just the source of where the good and bad games are coming from have changed just as drastically as the technology has. But we still have passionate, artful, revolutionary, and incredibly important games coming out every year. But that also doesn't excuse the industry for giving players something to be mad about. Ubisoft saying you shouldn't own your games, or Nintendo trying to charge you $100 for fucking Mario Kart, are the exact things to galvanize a player base, a consumer base, against anything and everything. But they don't make the good games worse, They're just a sign of how the market itself has gotten worse, which is a different argument, and in that case, I totally agree. Although then I guess you have to semantically separate where do games lie and the market lie, are they even separate to begin with? I'm not here to get into the nuance of that, I'm just saying for the case of what I'm talking about today, I'm considering them to be separate things. Now, this next segment dips into some social and political territory. If that's not your thing, you can skip to the timestamp on screen, but I think it's important to address these arguments head on since they've shaped the way people talk about games today, and they have for far longer than they should have. One of the things I've seen a lot, mostly from the corners of grifters who have an agenda to push about minorities, is that somehow DEI, or woke, or women are to blame. The idea that somehow, literally, female developers are just worse at making video games. This is not a collection of fringe comments, these are fabricated opinions of grifters who get millions of views every month and peddle their sad ideas onto young jaded men who don't know any better and need someone to blame, because shifting the real issues onto the capitalistic systems that literally gamify art and make it so that these endeavors of entertainment have to be commercially viable are somehow not at fault. I'm just going to state here, this is not an opinion, this is just how the world works. Having women, black people, or any other number of minorities involved or a part of your video games is not what's making them any shittier. Any loss in quality you'll find across the AAA market is so easily tracked to the needless demand for more value on the behalf of corporate shareholders, not some crazed schizophrenic conspiracy to turn you gay by leaving a rainbow icon that's entirely optional in the corner of the game. Can these massive corporations being annoying in the way they pander to diverse groups without the authenticity of care or respect behind them? Yes, and those do come up in some ways that feel a lot more preachy, but in no universe is a skin ever going to make your game physically worse. If Halo 3 had all the same skin sets that have been thrown into Halo Infinite, it would still be hailed as the greatest Halo game of all time. Or Reach, or Halo 2, take your fucking pick. But that being said, let's get back to the core of the video. The main thing, if anything, I'd want you viewers to take away from this is that there's always been a through line where commerce meets creation. But that quality is timeless. Even the games that don't hold up, even the Gears of Wars that are still clunky games to play today compared to its modern descendants, will always be remembered as the first, the big smash-out success that helped to define third-person cover shooters. I'm an optimist by nature. I like to give out a lot of hope and keep my expectations high. It's just more fun, more enjoyable to get the good out of things than to write off the whole for preconceived notions of being in the right camp, for having the right opinion or the best taste. Because taste is taste, it's nothing and it's everything. So when you have the option to choose between tasting bitterness for the sake of protecting your memories and tasting reality to enjoy everything no matter the objective quality, I implore you to love the games you love. Don't hate on some games for being outside your taste, for being not for you. If you consider it woke, who cares? Or cringe, or whatever, who cares? Just love the games you love, because whether games are new or old, they're here to be fun. And truthfully, as long as you or anyone else has fun with a game, regardless of how good it may be, then it's doing its job. Assassin's Creed Shadows, for all of its failures and as much as I may hate it, that's somebody's favorite game and there's nothing wrong with that. Old or new, broken or brilliant, messy or masterful, a good game is one that makes someone feel something. Mindless stimulus, immense joy, satisfaction, emotional climaxes, or just a small tingle of cozy comfort. So love your games and love them loudly. As always, I want to give a gigantic thank you to all my members and patrons who you can join for just $1 a month. Get videos early, your name here on screen or read aloud on higher tiers, as well as getting to vote on upcoming videos. Find those polls over on YouTube. As always, stay cool, have fun, be awesome. Buster out.